I would like to start with a few remarks concerning IFM investors' investment in infrastructure. And I'm proud that many of the stakes have been held since the outset of private ownership. Speaking to the assets represented by our panellists today, 20 years ago, in 1997, the fund made its early investments in Australian airports, including Brisbane Airport. The first investment in social public-private partnerships, or PPPs, occurred in 2003, and that includes wholly owned Southern Cross Station in Melbourne, Axiom Schools, Defence Headquarters Joint Operation Command Centre in New South Wales, and Perth District Courts. The Port of Brisbane represented the first investment in a seaport, and that occurred in 2010. And roll forward to the last 12 months with the major investment in Ausgrid. As Investment Director Infrastructure, I have been part of this exciting journey, both from the perspective of infrastructure asset management team, but I've also represented the shareholder on the boards of Brisbane Airport and then currently on the boards of the 4 PPP assets and the Port of Brisbane. Over this time, as a steward of these critical infrastructure assets, I have observed firsthand the value of the long-term partnership between ownership and management. And in my experience, this dynamic encourages sustainable investment to ensure that the asset maintains its relevance for the long term. And by that I mean constructive and mature stakeholder relationships at all levels. The other aspect to this is an enabler for growth through investment in additional capacity. And this is to alleviate not only constraints to growth, but indeed to support growth in patronage and usage of these assets. And the nature of these investments, in turn, make a significant contribution to economic growth and also to employment. Let's hear from John. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you for inviting me to speak to you today. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to start just with a little bit of background. So as Jill mentioned, I did work for the Department of Treasury and Finance in Victoria. I was there for 11 years. And I was involved in setting government policy around infrastructure procurement during that time. So I had the great pleasure and challenge, actually, of working on a number of significant projects across hospitals, wastewater, prisons, the convention centre, both there and later in Sydney, roads and rail. So broad experience, and the challenges at that time were actually sort of creating the right contractual environment for private investment and ensuring that services were being delivered to the public. The interesting thing now is that I've swapped out of that role and I'm now, as Jill said, involved in a number of these projects on the private side. In fact, the Southern Cross Station is a good example where I was heavily involved in the original procurement of that and now responsible for the organisation that actually manages that project. The thing that we always tried to achieve in government, and I think is being achieved, is this long-term approach to asset management or asset development and management and the long-term delivery of services. So services sits at the very core of what we are achieving and what InfraNexus needs to achieve today. There's a question I'm often asked, and I was asked particularly when I was in government, which was, so how can long-term concession agreements in relation to these assets actually allow for the flexibility around the asset and how government might want to change those services over time and how it might have the capacity how it might increase capacity. I think this goes to the core of the sort of discussion that we're having today. I mean, as we all know, governments are very often budgetary constrained in terms of enhancing assets or increasing their capacity. So I think there is a very strong role for the private sector to play in that. Southern Cross Station, again, is a very good example. The current volume of travellers using the Southern Cross Station in Melbourne already exceeds what was forecast as patronage in 2050. So not only is that patronage grown to that extent, but that western end of the CBD has already grown and developed significantly. So the station now sits at the sort of urban heart of Melbourne, with that growth that's occurring in Docklands. So InfraNexus has been on the front foot. We've been doing a lot of work about understanding how that capacity constraint can be removed, how we get, safety is a big issue on a station like that, getting people off platforms quickly, etc. And all of that is at risk when the asset operates at overcapacity. So we've prepared a proposal for the Victorian Government, which is being considered. One of the challenges about that is then the government looks at that and says, but we've got a Flinders Street station, we've got a Richmond station, which are in poor condition, yet you're asking us to think about how we improve Southern Cross Station. Having said that, this goes to the very maintenance aspect of these assets and the need for the private sector to take the initiative and increase the capacity and create and maintain these assets to the level that they need to be, so they don't fall into disarray, as we often see is the case. Happy to talk a little bit more about some relationships and how that works, but we'll probably do that a little later.
John, thank you. And I think you've certainly touched on some key aspects of that partnership between government and the private sector and how we look to optimise the experience for customers and users. Helen, over to you.
Thanks, Jill, and thanks for the opportunity to be here today. I'm very honoured to be the chairman of Ausgrid, which is a truly significant national asset. I think we all know the debate that is going on around energy in the public sector, and I think we all understand how good energy policy can contribute to productivity and contribute to economic growth. And to get that right, we need to have affordable energy, we need to have reliable energy, and it needs to be sustainable. They're the three legs of the stool. Ausgrid has an important role to play in that. It is the single largest distributor of electricity in Australia with 1.7 million customers. It operates in the growth areas of Sydney, the Central Coast and the Hunter with growth rates of around 3.9%, and it supplies 26,000 gigawatts of power a year. It's got a regulated asset base of $14.7 billion. IFM and Australian Super acquired 50.4% of Ausgrid in December last year, and I joined in March of this year. Against those 3 points of affordability, reliability and sustainability, we've got a work program that we're actively pursuing. On affordability, we're a highly regulated operation, and the regulator has told us that we've got to reduce our operating costs by 26%. We're working to achieve that objective. We're doing that with strong management of costs, but at the same time with a warmth, a respect and humanity that I think beholds and reflects the nature of our investors. On the reliability front, we are making significant selective investments in maintenance and CapEx, and in part we can also do that because of the strength of our investors. On the sustainability front, there are, as we all know, significant challenges that are emerging there, and trying to ensure that we get the balance right between traditional sources of fuel and wind and solar, and that we can manage that in a reliable way as a distributor is absolutely essential. Also being able to assist with demand management, particularly around contested meters where we have a 30% market share, is obviously significant. We take our responsibilities very seriously. Safety is first and foremost. We start every single board meeting with a discussion about safety. We're embarked on a major cultural transformation program, which will make this a really wonderful place for our employees to work. And we're investing for the long haul. We're doing this, as I see it, for the nation. We're also doing it for our shareholders, and many of the people in this room are members, your members are beneficiaries of our being able to deliver better, more financially sustainable energy over the long haul. Thanks.
Helen, thank you. And I think certainly you've touched on some key themes around the importance of sustainable energy policy and also safety first. And I would say that for all of our infrastructure assets, safety is the number one priority. So thank you very much. I'm now pleased to welcome Krishan Tangri.
Thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak on this issue. I'll first provide a brief introduction on Brisbane Airport, and then I'll discuss the benefits of privatisation, especially to Brisbane Airport. Brisbane Airport is a premier gateway to Queensland. It's the largest in size, 2,700 hectares, and third largest in passenger numbers, about 23 million. It was privatised in 1997 from FSA, a government enterprise at a sale price of $1.4 billion. BAC is 80% owned by mum and dad investors through superannuation funds and 20% by Schiphol Airport. BAC also holds a 50-year lease with a 49-year option. Even though the airport is privatized, there are airport lease conditions and light-handed regulation overseeing the airports. So let me now talk about the benefits of privatization. All the major airports compete for share in international passengers, and this has resulted in more than doubling the passenger numbers in 1996 from 67 million to 154 million today. And to meet this demand, the airports have invested heavily in capacity expansion. In case of Brisbane Airport, the passenger numbers have grown from 9.5 million to 22 million today. Aircraft movements have jumped from 128,000 to 218,000 today. To meet this demand, BAC has invested $2 billion in expansion of aero capacity. And the connection from Brisbane to domestic and international destinations have increased from 55 to 81 today. In addition, BAC business plays an important role in the economy of city, the region, the state, and ultimately Australia. The airport supports 23,000 jobs today, and it will be growing to 50,000 by 2035. The total economic contribution, direct and indirect, stands at $5 billion today, growing to $13 billion in 2035. The airport is also a strong enabler of tourism and freight industry. There has been a benefit to the government also. Privatization has allowed the government to spend its scarce resources on education and health rather than investing in airport infrastructure. It would have been really challenging for the government to invest in or justify investing in 4 major runways which are coming in next 10 years. On the other hand, in contrast, the recent ACCC report indicates that the 4 major airports have invested $7 billion across 10 years. Capital investment is not the only good story. BAC also has excelled in the customer service. BAC was recently voted as the best airport in Australia Pacific by air travelers in the 2017 Skytrax World Airport Awards. BAC also consistently stood first in quality of service for 13 consecutive years in the ACCC monitoring report. BAC understands the social license that the airport operates under and actively invests to gain social capital with the community and the government. We have a very strong and proactive engagement program with community, industry, and government. We support local schools and community organizations through Community Giving Fund. We provide sponsorship to high-profile cultural and artsy programs as well as sports events. In conclusion, the private investment in the airport has been beneficial to all of its stakeholders, from the shareholders to government, airlines, and the public. The passenger numbers have grown significantly. We are more connected to domestic and international destinations than ever before. There's a boost to jobs and economy. Operational performance in terms of customer service have improved. And last but not the least, the government can invest in more pressing areas of economy. Thanks.
Krishan, thank you very much. You've certainly touched on the importance and the significance not just of the financial investment, but also the investment in social capital. Thank you. It is now my pleasure to introduce Roy Cummins.
Thank you, Jill. And certainly a number of the themes which you've raised today are directly relevant for the Port of Brisbane. The Port of Brisbane is very much the cornerstone, the trading hub, not just for Queensland, but indeed for the east coast of Australia. To put that in context, we handle some $50 billion worth of trade per annum. We handle 2,500 ship calls, 94% of the state's containers and cars. We handle over 450 different diverse commodities, resulting in trade between 150 countries. So the scale is impressive and the importance of the economy is impressive, and we recognise that most significantly. Obviously, from our perspective, we see our core purpose as enabling prosperity by growing trade sustainably. And if you think about that, that really speaks to the issue of having a long-term view of the country, of the economy, and having a long-term appetite to invest in projects which will fulfil that goal. And that's why it's very important for us to have a shareholder base which supports that. To illustrate the point, I can tell you that over the last 5 years, we have invested in the order of $500 million in the infrastructure assets that we operate. And our forward CapEx projections for the next 5 years are in excess of that. We're probably looking somewhere north of $600 million worth of investments. So it's significant long-term thinking that is required. Perhaps I could give you a bit of flavour of the types of investments that we indulge in. Some of those are tangible, some are intangible. From a tangible perspective, we are at the moment involved in the $110 million upgrade to our road access to the port. This, in simple terms, is the single largest road project the port has embarked upon. It's important for the long-term capacity of the port, but frankly speaking, we're investing in this infrastructure ahead of demand because, to the point that Jill just made, safety is also an important consideration in everything we do. So we're very keen to ensure that all of those businesses, employees, and 3.5 million trucks which use our motorways every year will have an enhanced safety experience. And that project will complete, we anticipate, early next year. So that's hard infrastructure. We also invest in what you might call the more innovation space, and I'm very pleased to tell you that in August we launched world-leading technology in the form of a software package called NCOS Online. This is a software development which enables the harbour master and ship's captains to access the port through our 90-kilometre shipping channel in more flexible and dynamic conditions. Put simply, it enables larger ships to come into the Port of Brisbane more easily. Now that's a good thing for the industry. It saves time, it creates efficiency. It's a good thing for us too because it means we don't have to deploy hard CapEx to deepen channels in the way which traditional thinking might require. So that's very much us trying to do things differently. I think the other important point I'd like to tease out, Jill, if I may, is regarding the environment. we take our environmental custodianship of the port extremely seriously, and we conduct a myriad of different environmental projects. Our signature project at the moment is one which we call our off-site stormwater management project. This is a multi-award-winning project, and in fact what we're doing is spending money rehabilitating and regenerating riverbanks 100 kilometres away from the port in the Lockyer Valley. And you may say, well, that's a strange thing to do for the port. Why would you invest in that? And the answer is simple. We conducted scientific studies which demonstrated that 80% of the sediment reaching Moreton Bay was coming from some of the richest farmland in Australia in the Lockyer Valley. So rather than spending money on hard infrastructure where the problem was ending up, we're spending money at the cause. And with our partners, we're partnering with government and with academic institutions. We've so far conducted a pilot study where we've regenerated 2 kilometres of riverbank, and we've measured the results. And I can tell you, after 1 year alone, we have prevented nearly 9,000 tonnes of sediment reaching the bay. That's 200 dump trucks worth of dirt. That's also good for business. In the long term, that's less material we need to dredge. And we are responsible for dredging and maintaining a maritime highway, a shipping channel, which is almost 100 kilometres long. That has some challenges also. It requires long-term thinking. And part of our management solution is in our land reclamation strategy. So we have a very long-term strategy to reclaim land, deposit dredge material, and develop land for future demand. And that's a very, very complex task, one which I could talk about for quite some time. But I hope that gives you a bit of a flavour of some of the aspects we're working on. We're also investing for growth. We are currently deep into the throes of a market-led proposal process with the Queensland State Government, which, if successful, will result in us developing a new greenfield mega cruise ship facility which will handle the largest ocean-going vessels close to the heart of Brisbane. So I hope that gives you a little bit of a flavour of what we're doing.
Thank you, Roy. You've touched on quite a few of the themes in our topic today, and I think particularly around growing trade sustainably and the importance of access, both marine and land access, to be an enabler of that economic growth. I'm looking at the questions here. We have quite a few, and whilst we're on the theme of the environment and ESG, Roy, you've touched on the great work that the Port of Brisbane has been doing with the Healthy Waterways project. I would like to pick up on one of the questions from the audience here, which says that trustees are increasingly expected to consider ESG. How do management and boards of infrastructure report and engage in a world of increasing activism? And one of the projects that I think has been notable in both its long-term planning but also some of its environmental engagement, reporting and history is just on our doorstep, which is the new parallel runway project at Brisbane Airport. So if I may throw to Krishan perhaps to open comments, and then any of the other panellists are welcome to add to that. Thank you.
Thanks, Jill. Just a little bit about the runway project first. Those who haven't heard it before, it's the largest aviation project currently until the Western Sydney Airport starts. It's also the first runway being built by a privatized airport in the world, probably. So in terms of the runway project, the planning for that project started about in 2005, started with environmental impact statement, and then going into the design. The first phase was consolidation of ground conditions. That's now complete. We are now into the second phase. So the project was done very well. In terms of that question which you just said, is there a couple of the comments I would like to make. One is when you're designing an infrastructure like runway, which is going to last probably next 100 years or so. We look at climate change impact, for example. We look at 1 in 100 flood levels. So we do the risk assessment quite thoroughly and make sure that those assets, which are long-term assets, are designed properly. So that's just one example. The other thing I'll probably mention that in terms of what we do at BAC at least, we actually released our first sustainability report under the GRI framework. And the GRI is the Global Reporting Initiative, and it's a standardized reporting format, which basically explains the impact of their business on a range of sustainability issues such as climate change and human rights. We also have got level 3 accreditation, ACI accreditation, which is a 4-step program to achieve carbon neutrality. So we take quite an active interest in demonstrating our sustainability credentials. The other thing I'll mention is during the project also we were very mindful of the environmental management and the couple of initiatives which I would like to just share. One of them was we had 300 hectares of land with trees. We obviously when we cleared the trees, rather than taking them away, we mulched them and mixed with the soil, and now that topsoil is going to be used for landscaping in the phase 2 of the project. The other one, we had a contaminated soil, acid sulfate soil, and we treated on site, and then that material was used as a bunding material during the dredging operations. So that's the sort of thing we do, and we are very mindful to support the sustainability and environmental management.
Thank you, Krishan. Would any of the other panellists like to say anything further on environmental reporting and
well, perhaps if I talk about some of the sustainability issues from an energy perspective, I'd just mention two. Obviously, the profound change that's occurring in energy to particularly wind and solar is quite significant. Our role particularly is to ensure that can be accommodated in a flexible way within the distribution sector, and we're investing quite a lot to facilitate that occurring. Another example occurs around demand management, that there is a quite significant development around people wanting particularly through connected home, to be able to manage their electricity bills, and in that context our metering, the work that we're doing in metering is helping facilitate that. The other big area which is really quite important both from an environmental and a sustainability perspective is around clearing of bush in advance of the fire season. And we've, as Ausgrid and as a PPP, have moved that forward from what's been done before quite significantly and quite deliberately, to try to ensure that we mitigate as much as possible the risk of bushfire that can often be linked to fires coming from electrical generation. So they're just a few of a multitude of things that we're doing. Thank you.
We have a number of questions here in time, I think probably for 2 or 3. The one that I have had a few questions on is around innovation and disruption. And there's one specific question here, I'll read this out. How do you model the end game of each of your hard assets when long-term solar is decentralised and almost free, and we all fly in personal robot cars? So I think it's a changing world, and I'm certainly aware that at our assets we try to look into the future, knowing that we don't know the answers, but it is about change. And perhaps I might start with Roy and ask you to perhaps comment on how the Port of Brisbane is trying to look at that long term and respond to it in the face of tremendous change.
Thank you for that easy question, Jill. You're quite right. We are facing extreme volatility and change in practically everything we do. If you think about the cargoes that we handle at the port, we handle everything from containers to coal to cement to cereals to cars. Every single one of those commodities is going to undergo change. So we need to think about what the implications are for us. On the one hand, we think that large-scale shipping is here to stay. And there's some very simple reasons for that. The nature of those ships may change. They may use different fuels. They may not have pilots or captains. But the sheer scale of shipping is here to stay. And if I could share an anecdote with you to illustrate that. Every day at the moment, multiple shipping consortia run ships between Europe and Asia. Services running every day from a dozen ports in Asia to Northern Europe. And the average size of one vessel currently is about 18,000 containers, 18,000 TEUs. If you tried to replace that one ship with some other mode of transport and you took all of the containers off and you put them on the train, that one train from that one ship, from that one port on that one day would be over 100 kilometres long. So the scale is just of a different order. And shipping gives you that ability to keep costs down. However, having said that, will the nature of supply chains change? And I think that is absolutely likely to occur. We can already see the so-called Amazon effect, where the previous model of supply chains typically was customer wants something, order is placed by manufacturer, factory in China produces it, moves it to the port in China, shipped to a port in Australia, port loads onto stevedore moves to warehouse goes to store goes to customer. There are probably 3 or 4 links in that chain which are likely to disappear in the next 10 years. And that has lots of implications for us as a port, because we can no longer assume that our role is simply to act as a node, because a node sometimes just implies a cost to a supply chain. We're increasingly going to have to adapt our value proposition to be one where we actually transmit value to that supply chain. And when you think of how it's changing, that's going to mean things such as efficiency, speed, and data transfer. And that is where our focus is going to be. So we're very much looking at how we can play our role to speed up the throughput of cargo from waterside through to customer. Our InCos Online is a very tangible example of that, but we have other ideas which would be relevant on the land side also. And clearly the ability to have transparency of data in a way which isn't currently available in the supply chain is very important, and I think that's an area where the port will play an increasingly important role.
Thanks, Roy. I was going to ask Krishan very briefly, before I move on to the next question. Will we have car parks in the future?
Very interesting question. We are planning to build a car park in near future, starting the planning for that in international terminal. And we took probably 6 to 9 months to doing studies to anticipate what is the future of Uber, automation, all of those sort of things. And considering that the car parks have a payback period of 20 to 30 years, it was quite a challenge for us. And we believe that we might be building one of the last car park on the airport at this stage, because the model will change for sure in the car parking with the shared rides, Uber and automation. At the same time, I will probably also add to it, there are opportunities as well which we should be afraid of taking up. For example, just picking up from Roy's, we have got self-service, we have got biometrics coming, which will increase the throughput and delay the capital investment required for facilitating large volume of passengers. So it's both sides. It's a fast-changing world, and we believe that every company is a technology company now, and we just need to be aware of the challenges as well as opportunities.
Thanks, Krishan.
Jill,
John,
just,
please.
I think we're all faced with these challenges, particularly if you're working in the infrastructure area. And the key to it is, nobody knows the answers yet. The key is option analysis when you're building or expanding your infrastructure, and flexibility. And they're the tools that we have available to us today.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of hard thinking and planning has got to go into that.
And Helen, I think the energy sector is ripe with change.
Indeed it is, and obviously monitoring global trends, seeing what they are, being fleet of foot and agile in terms of placing bets selectively, both for us in the deregulated part of the market, as well as being able to respond so that you can reverse the flow of power will be, in the initial instance, really quite critical. But at the same time, you've got, as this transition takes place, and it will, we don't precisely know what the shape of it will be, we've also got to make sure we keep the lights on. That is absolutely essential. So it is also about managing the security of supply for people now, as well as managing for the future. And that really takes both a long-term view on the one hand, but great agility on the other hand. And getting people and leaders in your business who have got those kind of skills and that kind of mindset and that commitment to a future is really that will unfold progressively and in a sustainable way is absolutely critical.
Yeah. So I think we've certainly touched on agility and vision in the comments we've just heard from our panellists. I'm going to really stretch the time here and ask one more question. I like this question. It is, how do you keep the concept of operating for the public good as a service to the citizens alive and promoted when privatised? Is it just about legal contracts? John, I wondered if you could make a brief comment on that before I wrap up.
Yeah, look, contracts or concession deeds in the case of PPPs play an important role. They have an abatement regime attached to them, so if you don't actually provide all of the services to the level or the standard contracted, then the investor will actually be abated and you'll lose money. Terrific. That handles the risk. No, it doesn't. There has to be reputation and relationships are absolutely critical to the success of either privatised assets or assets procured through PPPs. And that relationship must be transparent, it must build trust, and not only between the private sector party and government, but with communities, particularly local communities, with those that are the recipient of the services that are being provided. So at all levels, there has to be a very high level of transparency and trust.
Thank you, John. Unfortunately, we'll have to wrap up there in terms of questions. There's been a lot of interest in this subject and a lot of questions. I would like to now take this opportunity to thank our panel for sharing their insights and anecdotes. And I think we can all be proud of the significant role that these critical infrastructure assets play in the daily lives of many individuals and industries. And we are all acutely aware of the significant population growth that is forecast to take place along Australia's eastern seaboard cities, and the large infrastructure task that lies ahead of all of us. And combined with the trends of ageing population, progression to a more service-oriented economy, and against the backdrop of low interest rates, we believe that investment in infrastructure remains critical to supporting and enabling long-term economic growth and investment. Can you please join me now in showing our appreciation to our four panellists? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.